Thank you for kind introduction, Dino. It's really my great pleasure to be here today, not only because I'm a faculty member of the Division of Internet Studies, but also as a member of the Council of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is a new international organization, but still fast growing. It already has more than 100 secretary member staffs, and then having the member countries from the 20 different parts of the world. Today, I'm here not only as a professor, but as a member of the council. So one of my recent activities as a council member is to introduce the GGGI activities outside, not only in Korea, but also outside Korea as well. So I've been visiting many universities and the ministries and the think tanks and other organizations, and I have been doing the similar presentations for the students and the government officials and the general public as well. So today, what I'm going to talk about is why this type of the global scale of the organization has been created and why is this in Korea, and then what this organization needs to do in the future. Okay, so by the way, GGGI, Global Green Growth Institute, is the climate change organization. So many people, including staffs in the GGGI, still think that it's a development organization. Climate change is a part of development issues, but it's not an ODA organization, in other words. It's a climate change organization. I played a sort of the initial role to start to think about the creation of the GGGI before President Office of Republic of Korea started to think about this, meaning I was the person actually who initiated some of the basic ideas about this organization by introducing some of the international experts to the President Office under the Lee administration. At the time, initial name of this organization was ICE, Institute of Climate Economics. So meaning that GGGI is a international organization which deals with the climate change issues. Also, before I go to the next slide, if you are aware of the Korea's low carbon green growth policy, this specific policy also focuses on climate change related issues because the term of low carbon. Okay, Korean government introduced the basic legislations on the low carbon green growth, meaning that Korea's previous policy, even current policy in the context of green growth, is climate change focused. All right. So let me start with how serious climate change problem is. I think that you don't want to spend hours and hours to hear from me about the serious impact of climate change. We all know that climate change is a very, very serious global problem, right? And once you disperse the CO2 in the air, it goes right away. Okay. Whereas such other pollutants such as NOxes and SOxes, they stay above your head for a while. So the characteristics of the CO2 and other greenhouse gases actually makes everything as a global problem. Okay, they don't know the existence of the sovereign territory. Okay, it becomes a global problem. It comes from the global warming, but global warming doesn't necessarily mean that it only brings the hot summer and winter. It can also bring the cold weather as well. So assume that you have a cup in front of you, right, like that, and then you put the water inside and it smells down, right? Then do you think that level of the water would be changed or not? When the ice in the cup would be melt down, when the melt down, it doesn't change, right? But you have a paper, you put the ice here, and then you have a cup, and then when the ice melts down, then do you think the level of the water will be increased or stay as it is? It will be increased, right? This is the problem of sea level rise. So when entire Earth gets warmer, then ices on top of the continent in the two poles, right? Arctic and Antarctic, when they smelt down, then the waters can come into the sea, right? If you think about the water between the Europe and then in North America, right, there is a Arctic, right? When the the ices melt down, and then they will let those water come into the sea, right? As you know that the weather pattern in this Western Europe is different from that of Korea, right? Even if they have a similar latitude, right? Located because because of the warm current, right? Coming from the Mexico, right? But when the cold water comes in, then of course the current flow would be changed. Then the immediate impact of the global warming will bring you the very cold Europe. Okay, because of the change the weather pattern, then the impact that you will get will be not only about the hot weather, but also very cold weather and possibly ice era as well. Okay, so climate change is a very serious problem. If we still want to raise some of the questions whether or not climate change is really real, then you go to some other 5% of the total scientists who still claim that climate change is not real. Okay, so I agree with those 95% scientists who together said that climate change is man-made, man-induced problem. Okay, all right. So let me talk about CO2 emissions, right? We know that the climate change problem is caused by, as I said, basically greenhouse gas emissions, and then the typical representative greenhouse gas is a CO2, right? So in order to tackle climate change, then you have to reduce CO2 emissions, basically, right? So this shows to you that the list of the countries which emits more greenhouse gases than any other countries in the world. And number one country as of today is China. Okay, China is the biggest CO2 emitters in the world. Followed by United States, EU, India, Russia Federation, Japan, and Germany. Before looking at this more, ask yourself, okay, we want to tackle climate change, and who should bear more responsibility to reduce the CO2 emissions? And user answer will be rich countries, in other words, developed countries. And if you study a little bit more about the climate change before, then you should know about the concept of the historical responsibility, right? Rich countries emit the CO2s as much as they wanted, when they developed their, economy during the Industrial Revolution, right? So why do we have to bear the same kind of the responsibility among those developing countries, possibly including Korea, before we developed our economy as much as rich countries did, right? We also assume that the amount of CO2s that countries would emit would come more from the developed countries. That used to be true around 1992 when the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was adopted. Okay, so all this global architecture to deal with climate change was first introduced in 1992 when Rio conference was organized in Brazil, right? And the several major then international environmental treaties were adopted, including UNFCCC, and then Convention on the Biological Diversity, and then desertification, to tackle the desertification. There were three major global environmental treaties, and the climate change treaty was one of them. We called it as UNFCCC. At the time, the largest emitter was the United States. As you can see, if you see that China, actually they have 3 bars, right? The first bar is about the level of the 1990, right? Second bar, 2000. Third one, 2012, right? So currently China, this represents level of the 2012. But if you think about the 1990, right, it's much smaller, right? So current regime that you have to tackle climate change is based on situation in 1990, okay? So United States. And then interesting is that if you look at carefully those graphs, then actually pattern of emitting greenhouse gases are different between the developed countries and developing countries. As I said, China, right? It used to emit greenhouse gases much less than now, right? Developed countries, whether similar or declining, okay? Maybe because they wanted to introduce more environment-friendly, mechanisms so that they try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? Or for some other reasons. And based on this, currently, what we need to do in terms of the, tackling climate change, according to the study, we have to reduce so-called 19 gigatons. That's a lot of CO2s. How much? 19 gigatons by 2030. In order to meet the target, there was a proposed by International Panel on Climate Change. This is a scientific organ in climate change area within the UN system. Okay, so scientists basically told us that, okay, if you don't want to die, you have to maintain, the amount of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, 450 ppm. So in order to maintain this level by 2030, how much do we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? 19 gigatons relative to so-called BAU, business as usual level, meaning that if you wouldn't do anything, right, there is a sort of projection, right, of the emission of the greenhouse gas emissions. But if we want to survive, you have to reduce how much? 19 gigatons. Then ask yourself, among 19 gigatons, how much do we need to reduce by developed countries or developing countries? Ask yourself. Answer, 5 gigatons versus 14 gigatons. You pick 14 gigatons for developed or developing countries. Who needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? 14 gigatons needs to be reduced by developing countries. 5 gigatons needs to be reduced by developed countries. This is a very interesting situation. Why? According to current UNFCCC regime, the other way goes around. In other words, it only asks developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by average 5% using the baseline of 1990 level. So this is a general agreement that has been agreed by the members of the UNFCCC, and it has been implemented by not only UNFCCC but also Kyoto Protocol. Okay, so basically among the countries, about the 200 countries, only developed countries which are listed in Annex 1, so we call them as Annex 1 countries, right? They have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by average 5% using the baseline, using the level that they used to emit their greenhouse gas emissions in 1990 until 2012. So we are in 2014, right? So we are in the second stage. Basically, this is the basic framework. So meaning, for developing countries, including China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Korea, Mexico, South Africa, they don't have to do anything. Look at this. Unless they wouldn't do anything in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, what can we do in terms of tackling climate change? This is a serious problem. Right? How many will come from the developing countries? Raise your hand. Korea is a developed or developing? According to classification under the UNFCCC, it's a developing country. How many of you? Raise your hands. Many of you, right? Are you ready to ask your government to take legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? If yes, raise your hands. You are climate change ambassador of your country. Are you willing to commit yourself to do so in the negotiation? Raise your hands. You have a little chance, some chance to go to the jail as soon as you arrive in your airport after finishing your negotiation. Because, industry people, right, will say, no, this is something that we cannot accept, right? Why do we have to bear the social cost, right? This is not possible. Right? This is general attitude, not only in developing countries, but also developed countries as well. Meaning that people usually think that tackling climate change is a matter of cost. Right? You might think that, okay, I want to tackle climate change, then we have to make some efforts, right? Which would create some sort of kind of social burden, right? This is a general attitude, right? That the general public has, and even the many government and industrial people have, right? So what I'm saying here, politically, we are in a very, very difficult situation, actually, to make very effective efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For developed countries, difficult. For developing countries, very, very, very difficult, because current legally binding treaties called UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol tell us that, developing countries, you guys, you don't have to do anything. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? So if we study economics a little bit, then you know that environmental matter is a matter of externality, right? It's an externality problem. So usually, in order to address the environmental problems, you have to decide who bears the cost, right? On the supply and demand curve, you know what I'm saying, right? If we study the basic economics. So very, very difficult. And, things that would make the situation more complicated is when you take a look at individual country cases situation. This is the situation in the United States. So according to DOE, Department of Energy, they went through the study which sector emits more greenhouse gas emissions. So it says coal-fired power plants represent 26% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Because as you know that the United States is rich of coal, right? It's relatively cheaper for United States to make electricity by burning the coal. So this is a rational choice, right? For both for the government and for the industry, right? In order to run your economy. So therefore, U.S. has 20% representation from the coal-fired power plant sector. And then if we go to if we want to drive a car, which country is the best to drive a car? United States. So therefore, 16% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States come from transportation sector, especially light-duty vehicles, right? So this immediately implies to us, okay, in the United States, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which sectors do you have to work on? You have to reduce coal-fired power plants, and you have to introduce some sort of technologies, right, which will help the vehicles to emit less emissions, right, like a hybrid, or introduce some sort of regulation which will ask, right, car makers to meet a certain minimum level in terms of fuel efficiency, right? So there will be the immediately available solutions for the United States. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case for other countries. This is the case of Mexico, okay? Mexican government told us that in Mexico, most greenhouse gas emissions are coming from electricity and heating sector, okay? Followed by some others, manufacturing and construction, and transportation sectors, almost equal. So in Mexico, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, actually you need to focus on some other different sectors, right? Not necessarily, you are not supposed to follow what the United States is going to do, right? If I show you one more, I'm sorry I didn't include it here, like Brazil. Ask yourself, which sector would be most important in Brazil? Forestry. You cut the trees in the Brazil, meaning you can absorb the CO2 from the atmosphere, which is the same as if you actually would emit CO2s in the atmosphere. You understand what I'm saying? So in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil, what you need to work on is forestry, right? Almost 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil come from cutting the trees. So therefore, but here, the tricky thing in case of Brazil is this. For Brazilian people, this is not fair request. I want to develop economy, right? So why am I supposed to preserve the trees? This is not only for us, also for someone else, like people in Korea. Why do I have to sacrifice myself for the benefits of Korea? That's true, right? So, unless international community find out some of the incentive mechanisms for Brazil enough to preserve those forestry, they wouldn't do it. You understand what I'm saying? Indonesia also has a lot of forestries, right? In the 1990s, there was a big forest fire in Indonesia. For 5 months, amount of the CO2s that they emitted because of this forest fire was more than the total amount of the CO2 emissions of the Western Europe. Why it happened? Because big companies in Indonesia wanted to cut the trees to plant palm oil trees, right? It's an industrial purpose. So cheapest way to cut the trees is burn trees. But somehow, in that specific year, it was very hot. So, they couldn't control, right? So we are talking of very different things, right? Korea is a very difficult situation because Korea has been regarded as some sort of good model for developing world, right? Because Korea is #1 in shipbuilding. Korea is one of the #1 countries in the chemical industry. You didn't know that, right? Korea is almost #1 in steel, right? Many sectors are energy intensive, right? So it's very difficult for Korea actually to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it requires somewhat different type of the policy measures, different from those of the United States or Mexico or Brazil. Okay, so here things get very complicated. First, we think that climate change is a very serious problem, right? Nobody disagrees on this, right? Number two, we have to reduce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but actually more greenhouse gas emissions needs to be reduced by developing countries who don't have any legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Number three, different countries have a different picture in terms of which sector emits what kind of emission, greenhouse gases, right? So in other words, what I'm implying, it wouldn't be a good idea for you to just ask every country, hey, you have to make your efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this amount. Things are not that simple. You understand what I'm saying? So I already talked about the several things in this slide. So currently, in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the major umbrella framework is UNFCCC, right? So UNFCCC was introduced in 1992, followed by Kyoto Protocol, which was introduced in 1997. So here, top-down approach, meaning that, okay, the schemes this UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol have is that by giving legally binding obligations to the countries, from the sovereign country's point of view, it's a top-down, right? Because a treaty asks the countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions based on legally binding obligations. So that's why it's top-down from the sovereign country's point of view, right? So mainly, they adopted a so-called top-down approach. This is a popular approach that has been used in the domestic setting, okay? In your country, in almost all the countries, right? Ministry of Environment is a regulation-based ministry, right? They regulate things, right? And this is the methodology that domestic society usually use, right? And this methodology has been put in place in international society. When were you born? 1987, right? And then your history is longer than that of the climate change, right? Most of you, right? In other words, whole history of the global climate change is shorter than most of your history. Isn't surprising, right? It's just a young baby. I know you're still young, and it's younger. So don't expect climate change regime do as if they are, adults. Climate change regime is still young. But methodology that this young baby is using is things that used to be used by old people. Meaning, in the global society, there are many differences. There is no central government. Have you ever elected any president of the world? No. Have you ever elected any member of the Congress of the world? No. Is there any world court? No. ICJ is kind of a court, not a world court. Right? So meaning, global society is very fragmented. It's a sovereign state-based, very fragmented society. In order to implement regulations, you need to have several preconditions to meet. Number one, you need to have information, right? You need to know who emits what, how much, when, how, right? So that you can place some sort of regulatory measures, right, against it, right? So you need to have information. You need to have a monitoring system, right? You need to see who is doing what. Number three, you need to be able to punish those who do not comply with, measures, right? Then ask yourself whether or not international community has all these. Answer will be no. Some years ago, in the climate change negotiation, I go to climate change negotiation almost as a regular member for the Republic of Korea. Canada declared that they are not in a position to implement their legally binding obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. They declared it. They are very bad, right? How can he punish them? Can he bomb them? Can he impose trade restrictions? What can he do? Can he put Canada in jail? What can he do? Nothing. They've been morally accused, but legally there has been nothing done against Canada. Right? In this situation, as I told you, not only people, but also countries, states, see, even the companies see that climate change issues are matter of burden, right? Are you willing to take those burdens as much as you want, or more than what you are supposed to do? Probably not. This is a situation. This is some situation where you are facing the problem, and it comes from the top-down approach. By the way, and one interesting thing is that in Kyoto Protocol, if you read carefully, you heard about the emission trading schemes, right? ETS and CDM and joint implementations, right? These are not something based on top-down approach. So this idea was put in place by the United States. So basically, they want to see what would be the more effective way to tackle climate change, and they start to understand, okay, imposing legally binding obligations wouldn't work. Even it's very hard to agree on, right? So number two, what they thought about, wow, where does the problem of climate change come from? Oh, it comes from the economic activities of the human being. Then we have to tackle climate change in the market, right? In other words, if we run your economy in a more environment-friendly way, then it will help you to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while achieving some economic benefits, right? So what they did is these are, somewhat market mechanisms, right? No country is, forced to introduce the ETS, for example. It's their own choice. So this is something different from the top-down approach, right? Top-down, you have to do it, no matter whether you like it or not. But these market mechanisms, if you like markets, then you can consider it as a possible option. But these market mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol are only complementary, mainly for the developed countries who are supposed to implement the legally binding obligations based on top-down approach. So basically, UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol, mainly top-down organization, top-down approach, and with some complementary approach of the market mechanism, such as ETS, CDM, and joint implementation. Okay? There are also another problem. As you saw here, number one emitter in the world doesn't have any legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Korea, number 7. Korea is enjoying its freedom to emit greenhouse gases. Okay? India will be the largest greenhouse gas emitters in year 2030. India doesn't have to do anything. It's a very good situation for your children, right? If you see the IPCC report in year 2100, right? You know, we will see a serious problem that I mentioned before. Right? How many will be alive in the year 2100 here? Maybe some of you, right? But your children will be surely alive. They might die. Think about it. Unless you are very serious now to protect the climate. So, you know, from your heart, you think that you have to tackle climate change, but your brain doesn't function in that well, right? Oh, yeah, that's a global problem, but that's what you need to do, not me, right? You do it, I won't do it. Here, national interest, the concept of national interest is very harmful, right? Some of you may have an experience working for the government, and the motto that the government officials have is that you work for the national interest and possibly global interest, but you don't sacrifice your national interest for the sake of global interest. Climate change, as I said, is an issue of global, right? So this is a dilemma. So it's very difficult for, you know, China to decide to join the Annex 1 basket so that it can take legally binding obligations. China wouldn't do it. India wouldn't do it. Mexico wouldn't do it. Korea wouldn't do it, right? So this is a problem. So I talked about the legally binding without the effective use mechanism, how problematic it is, right? So now we know that this approach wouldn't work. So maybe it's time for us to think about the new approach, right? So here we go. We call it as new approach as bottom-up approach. Bottom-up means, you know, from sovereign countries' point of view, everything that is for reducing greenhouse gas emissions needs to be done by countries, by themselves. It is not, they are not supposed to be asked by others, including treaties, right? Taking Republic of Korea's low carbon green growth policy, right? It was announced by the former President Lee Myung-bak in August 2008. Korea has never been asked to introduce that policy, right? The President's office thought that, wow, you know, this word will create a new opportunity for the economy, in the country's growing economy. So we will introduce low carbon green growth policy as our new national vision, right? And then Korea voluntarily decided to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. Korea has never been asked by any treaty. It was decided on its own voluntary basis in order to promote more investments. It was a sort of kind of a way of, you know, creating a new market, right? Korea introduced the ETS system by itself. No country has ever asked Korea to do so. Right? Things that Korea has done under the policy of low carbon green growth was voluntary. This is exactly the bottom-up approach, right? Not only developing countries, but also developed countries can do so. If we go to UK, for example, they have developed a new policy called low carbon economy. So they emphasize the CCS technology, they emphasize some other green technology, even they emphasize nuclear, right? Because nuclear, even if it has some sort of controversial in terms of the social impact, but nuclear can be a viable option if you think about the low emission, right? Nuclear doesn't emit any single amount of the CO2, right? So, you know, this type of the bottom-up approach has started to be considered. So here the point is this, okay, you are not supposed to take a legally binding obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? You don't want to do it. And you see climate change as a problem because it gives you more burden. What I'm saying here is not a burden. It's an opportunity. It's only matter of opportunity. How? It guarantees your growing economy. We will help you to develop your economy by investing your money in the new area such as green technologies, low carbon green technologies. I think GSI has changed all these bulbs in this room with LED bulbs, right? It only uses 20% or less of the electricity. Do you feel any problem here in reading or writing? You feel almost the same quality of the service, right? From owner's point of view, right? Korea University, then by putting the LED bulbs there, it can save a lot of money. If electricity prices would be higher, you can save more money, right? If you drive your vehicle, say you commute from Suwon to Seoul every day, then you will certainly start to think that, okay, I want to buy hybrid vehicle, right? Because it only consumes, say, 50% of the fuel. So you enjoy the same quality of service, but using less energy, meaning that emitting less greenhouse gas emissions, right? Wind power, you don't care, whether or not this electricity was made by fossil fuel or wind power, as long as you can enjoy the same quality of service, right? If your country can promote wind power, right, then while it provides you with the same quality of service, but at the same time it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, all these doing things must be cheaper, right, than burning the coal, right? And if your government can design a social system in that way, right? In other words, putting all your resources in this energy efficient technologies or low emission technologies, then it will be good for your society. I will take another example in EU. As of today, in EU, you cannot use traditional bulbs. Companies cannot produce traditional bulbs, meaning they have to produce LED bulbs. Then do you think who has the technology to produce LED bulbs in the EU? Ask yourself. There are two companies. Osram and Philips. They are creating new market, right? Isn't it surprising? New market. Am I talking about protecting the environment? No, actually I'm talking about how to grow your economy, right? You understand what I'm saying? You grow your economy, as a result, you can solve the problem, which is good, right? I'm talking about it. This is a bottom-up approach. It would work better. If top-down approach would work well, then maybe it would work better. But we all know what I said is that top-down approach wouldn't work based on our experiences in the past, right? So in that sense, it works better. So it's an issue of certainly growth or development. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm talking about, say, you can transform your economy in this way. Taking United States, I emphasize two sectors, right? Do you know what? United States is very excited these days by finding new type of energy source. What is this? Shale gas. Why it is so attractive to the United States? First of all, it has a lot. Number two, when they burn shale gas, it emits less CO2s. Natural gas emit less CO2s, right? So to the United States, they have to phase out coal burning power plants, right? If they replace it with coal and shale gas, burning power plants, then it will work better. Of course, the best one will be not using any fossil fuel, but in the meantime, it will be better. The vehicles, what do? They try to impose, fuel efficiency standard, right? If we go to California, you see more hybrid vehicles because there are a lot of incentive mechanisms available, right? Rental companies, it's better for them to actually rent out hybrid vehicles because there are some incentives, right? For Brazil, what we need to do, totally different. If we go to UNFCCC negotiation, there is a negotiation agenda called REDD+. So if you preserve your trees, even if you want to cut your trees so that your emission, your number of the trees would be reduced, but if you keep this, we will give you financial incentives. So countries are discussing about this global scale of incentive mechanisms. And from Brazil's point of view, this is good, right? If those incentives are more than what they are supposed to earn by cutting the trees. You understand what I'm saying? Same with Indonesia. Right? So, whole issue is suddenly become a, economic growth. So here, let me ask you another question. Then among the different ministries, which ministry is supposed to be responsible for planning this growth scheme? You ask yourself. Which ministry? Growth planning. I'm talking growth planning, right? Which ministry is responsible for that? Ministry of Sports? Minister of Finance, right? Here in Korea, Minister of Strategy and Finance, right? Is responsible for macroeconomy policy, right? So previously, imposing regulations to protect the climate, which ministry is a primary ministry? Ministry of Environment. So I'm talking of shifting focus from the issues related to Ministry of Environment to Ministry of Finance. You understand what I'm saying? I'm talking about that. So in your country, when your Minister of Finance tries to make a plan for economic development, what do they usually do? They secure resources, financial resources, right? Sometimes by your national savings. Sometimes they get a loan from the World Bank or IMF, right? Or regional banks, right? Or in some other fashion, right? And usually, when they want to develop the economy, they focus on technology, right? Here in Korea, current government, ICT technology has been very much emphasized because they believe that ICT technology is a kind of driving force for economic growth, right? In the meantime, don't forget, this government also has still emphasized the importance of green technology as well, right? Sometimes the GT, BT, right? Technologies are driving force for economic growth, right? So now, if we go to UNFCCC regime, then in the negotiation, they are talking a lot about the so-called means of implementation, right? Meaning that in order to implement this bottom-up approach, several components are important, especially technology and finance. Everyone here knows the GCF, right? Green Climate Fund. It is very makes sense for us to have the GCF. The size of GCF will be similar to that of the World Bank as of 2020. Why? Not to protect the environment, but because there are important needs to grow your economy, especially in the developing countries side. You understand what I'm saying? Technology, I don't have to repeat it again, right? So all this new scheme in terms of guaranteeing your growing economy has been called in the UNFCCC regime as low carbon development strategy. or low emission development strategy. It is called in the Republic of Korea as low carbon green growth policy. If you go to China, they call it as low carbon development policy. If you go to Europe, especially UK, they call it as low carbon economy. Different main names, very similar approaches, already available. And here, the question is how we can further promote all these great ideas, right? Let me talk about the developing countries a little bit more. So we have to come back to previous discussions of mine today that in order to reduce 19 gigatons, who need to make more efforts? Developing countries, right? And the current scheme based on top-down approach doesn't actually encourage developing countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? So now I mentioned about the low carbon development strategy or bottom-up approach, right? So these approaches will be very helpful not only for developed countries but developing countries to make their further efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? As a result of implementing their growth planning, right? So if we go to UNFCCC regime, they talk a lot about the developing countries because 14 gigatons is the problem. Then the question is how to let developing countries to reduce these 14 gigatons. By the way, if we go to UNFCCC, there are about more than 160 developing countries. They are not all equally important in this context. Only less than 10 countries are important. I already listed them several times today. They are China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa. If we add whole amount of greenhouse gas emissions of these advanced developing countries, it will represent more than 80% of the total greenhouse gas emissions among developed countries. Interesting, right? In other words, small countries such as Fiji, actually they are not as important as with China in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Here another important lesson in climate economics. In climate economics, power is made based on amount of your emission, not number of your group. Okay? Currently, I told you that under the UNFCCC regime, only developed countries take the legally binding obligations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? And then this scheme has been continued in so-called second commitment period, which started last year up to 2020, right? Most of developed countries said, I would not participate in this scheme. So they got out of it. No punishment. Only EU countries remain in the basket. I'm not afraid of EU from political perspective because they only represent 15% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the world. How much? 15%. Check how much China is emitting greenhouse gas emissions by itself. Things will be very different. Okay? So all these things are very important for advanced developing countries, but at the same time, smaller developed countries would think that this approach would be important. For example, recently Ethiopia introduced a low carbon development plan, okay? And they asked the Global Green Growth Institute to help them actually to make a national development plan by identifying future, right, growth drivers, right? So in other words, even if they don't emit greenhouse gas emissions now, but they have a plan to grow their economy fast, right? So they ask the international organizations such as the GGGI to help them to identify which sector they are supposed to focus on so that it will guarantee the economic growth at the same time not emitting GHGs. right? So GGGI helped Ethiopia, and Ethiopia introduced that scheme as their national development plan. So in that sense, this kind of notion still makes sense for smaller developing countries as well. Even if I'm not talking about immediately reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but if they want to take, we call it as low carbon development path, growth path, right? If we want to take this path, then this idea still makes sense. So emission reduction strategy, finance, national communication, technology issues, they are all important, right? I don't need to explain them more. So currently, countries are in the middle of the negotiating to design the new climate change regime, which will be effective beyond 2020, right? And they are supposed to finish current negotiation by end of next year. Okay, so my bet on the new climate change regime would be look like strengthen the bottom up. We cannot get rid of top down, right? And we have to amend the treaties which are very difficult, right? Top down will be there, but it will be softened, and then there is a strengthened component of the bottom up. Hey, Professor, what is this? I don't know. That's the matter of wording. Then countries are in the middle of negotiating detailed wordings. Unless they finish the negotiation, I cannot say anything concrete, right? I have my own idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean that other countries would agree on this, right? So we will see. But at least what I'm envisioning is that strengthen the bottom up and the soften the top down. Okay, all right. So low carbon green growth, again, it's an issue from the issue of cost. Now I'm talking about opportunities. From the issue of environmental protection to the issue of growth and development. So these days, my clients are Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment, Minister of Finance, Ministry of Industry, and others. I am very busy. This word asks me not only interact with the Minister of Environment, but interact with more ministries. I'm thinking about helping the Minister of Finance more than the Minister of Environment, because the nature of issues have been changed. I always tell this to my students in my environment class that do you know what? Environment issue is all about the money. Because environmental problems, including climate change, have been made as a result of human activity, economic activities. In order to solve the problems, then actually solutions come up with the ideas based on market. This is the experience that we have. So this is something that very different from what you have used to think about, right? Whenever you think about the environment, you want to go to the Ministry of Environment, but all the Ministry of Environments are struggling. I'm not saying that the Ministry of Environment is not important. They are important, but the scope that we are talking about now goes beyond not only protecting the environment, but more, right? In this world of bottom-up, still environmental protection component exists, right? But we are more variety of issues that we might want to give more emphasis on. This is my point. Don't tell Ministry of Environment, my colleagues saying that, oh, Professor Chung told us that the Ministry of Environment is not important anymore. No, this is not my, they are still important, but the landscape that we are looking at, it has become much bigger. So this is the UK case. As I said, I emphasize that those technologies that the United Kingdom still, now thinks that they have to invest all their, resources to develop these sectors. One of them include, carbon capture and storage, CCS technology, very expensive, but the UK produces, oils out of the continental shelf, so it becomes empty, right? So they can capture CO2s and put them again there. In Korea, some of the scientists, engineers used to say that, okay, CCS technology is very important for Korea, but I have some reservation because Korea doesn't produce oil. We don't have any place to store CO2s that we can capture. So implication is different, right? So you have to develop your own technology roadmap based on your country's specific situation and consideration. You understand what I'm saying? So there are three components: planning, finance, technology. All these three are important. Under the Lee Myung-bak administration of the Republic of Korea, they used to call it as green triangle. Green triangle is an architecture for the bottom-up approach. And it can be applied not only to Korea, but to other parts of the world. I used to talk about financing here. So currently, we have different financial sources, right? But because we shifted from just protecting environment to develop your economy, so financial needs that you have is much more than what you used to think about, right? So here again I put a question mark of GCF. How you can put the GCF, place the GCF. Size of GCF will be bigger than the total size of all those things. Okay. So GCF is a financial organization focusing on environmental issues. I would cautiously say that maybe I would be very cautious to say it's an environmental organization. It's more like a financial organization, right? So here, why GGGI? I need to come back to this. So now you understand that at the global level, financing aspect can be addressed by GCF, right? For technology, there are several organizations such as IRENA that is responsible for renewable energy technologies, and then CTCN under the UNFCCC. There are several organizations, right? But interesting enough, there is no single organization which can help countries to develop their low carbon development planning. So we need to have that type of organization, right? That's the Global Green Growth Institute. Global Green Growth Institute is not a research institute. GGGI is a name of organization. It has more than 100 steps now. It has 20 member countries. I always say that how we can conceptualize the GCF, then I always compare GGGI with OECD. So in the brown economy, think about what is the role of OECD. First of all, OECD is not a part of UN, right? When it started with 18 countries. When GGGI started about a year ago, it had 20 countries. GGGI is not part of the UN, outside the UN. Looking at the small participation of like-minded countries. Same with OECD. What OECD used to do, it actually provides a lot of good ideas on how to develop their economy, right? Helping countries, guiding countries. That's what GGGI is going to do in this new low-carbon economy. And GCF is important because it's a finance mechanism, right? And G20 will be equally important because G20 is a forum for finance ministers. So I have been advising my government of the Republic of Korea, for example, actually they have to be very active in G20 as well. Because there they can guide governments which are related to GCF can further focus on some of the important issues. By that, do you know what? If we add up all the amount of the greenhouse gas emissions of the G20 members, it will represent more than 80%. We have about 200 countries, right? But in order to address the climate change problem, actually you need to have about 20. Very interesting, right? And MEF is a major economics forum, which has been led by the United States. And then one of the key points of the MEF is that it emphasizes the importance of market and technology. So if we build a governance system where all these important organizations can effectively interact, actually we can ensure the economic growth at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So don't be afraid of talking about climate change. Climate change will give you an opportunity. And GGGI, identified a very important role by providing services to the countries, and for now, developing countries. But as a council member of the GGGI, I also envision that GGGI can provide similar services to developed countries as well. Taking Greece. Greece is a serious problem now, right? If they want to develop a new growth plan based on this new idea, but I don't think the Greece government has adequate capacity to do so. So in the case, if they ask GGGI to help them, I think why not, right? GGGI can help even developed countries. GGGI can help Korea as well, even if Korea played a very, very important role in creating GGGI, but who knows, later, GGGI might be able to help Korea as well. So financing technology is important. This tells us, another story, but I'm running out of time. I'm just skipping this slide. Coming back to GGGI, GGGI is headquartered in Seoul, Korea. As I said, it has 20 countries, right? There are several countries which make financial donations to GGGI. Republic of Korea, largest donor, also hosting country of the GGGI. And the UK and UAE, Qatar, Norway, and Denmark, these are the contributing members. And then there are also other developing countries which don't make a financial contribution, but are still members of the GGGI. GGGI has 4 important major organs under its establishment agreement. That's the constitution of the GGGI. It has assembly. Assembly is technically supreme organ, okay, consisting of member countries. It's very easy for your country to become a member of the GGGI. You basically, bring the establishment agreement to GGGI and ratify them, get the consent from the Congress, and give that record, document back to the secretary of GGGI, then you will become a member. Very easy, right? Council is more important in a sense of directing secretariat, okay? Council composes a balanced number of the members, 5 contributing members, meaning that those who make financial contributions, right? 5 participating countries, meaning that they are members, but they don't make financial contributions, such as Indonesia, right? There is one host country, that's the Republic of Korea, right? It has a permanent seat. Interesting factor of the Council of the GGGI is that it also gives 5 seats to non-state actors. Ask yourself, as you saw even in previous slide, here, private sector has a lot of money, right? In order to meet those financial needs, actually governments cannot meet all those financial needs to grow new economy, right? Private sector's investments are very, very important, right? Without having the voting power, maybe private sector might be reluctant to participate in this endeavor, right? Who owns the technology? Government? No, actually many of those advanced technologies are owned by private sector. So GGGI take this very seriously and decided actually give up to 5 seats to non-state actors. Currently there are 3 non-state actors in the council. One is the former Prime Minister of Denmark, Rasmussen, who is also chairman of the council. And then Mr. Ahluwalia, that's the deputy chairman of the Growth Planning Committee of India. And then I myself. I don't necessarily represent the interest of the Republic of Korea. I'm supposed to serve the best interest of the GGGI as a whole. So I have one same voting power as a country, even if I'm the poorest member. Right? I can only buy the sandwiches for the Secretary of State. I cannot make a donation, but I have my own brain, right? So I'm directing the Secretariat in the context how GGGI can make an important role contribution in this complex, climate change governance. This is my role. Because this year I'm on sabbatical leave, so I have more time. So I go to Secretariat almost 3 or 4 days a week. I spend very busy days there, and then I don't get paid. So it's my, voluntary contribution. But I am very much interested in helping GGGI to identify the right path for its own growth. GGGI also has its own advisory committee, which deals with both of public-private cooperation issues. As I said, the private sector issue is very important. So that also advisory committee is supposed to provide some sort of advisory functions for the council as a whole. So that's the advisory committee. Secretariat is headed by the Director General. GGGI will have a new Director General next month. That's Mr. Ivo Dubois. I don't know whether you heard about his name. He used to be the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who led the Copenhagen climate change meeting. So he wants to come back to this work, and then he wants to champion everything with the GGGI. That's what I believe. Before coming to here, he used to work, after he resigned as the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, he used to work for the KPMG. That's a private consulting firm. Now you understand why he was there, right? Financing, consulting the private companies, right? By identifying the new path of growth, right? Then he's coming back to this public work, and then I assume that Ivo will make a great contribution for better development of the GGGI during his tenure. And then I'm thinking about bringing him to Korea University GSIS for some point in next fall quarter, next semester. And if you go to the website of GGGI, you can see all. But in terms of helping this new idea, right? There are 3 important pillars of the GGGI. So if you are interested in GGGI, at least you must remember this. GGPNI, that's a green growth planning implementation. Based on its term, right, name, you can assume that this is a department which helps developing countries to prepare for their own national new growth planning based on this idea, right? So GGPNI, they uses about 60% of the total budget. So it's a big department. Okay. Knowledge Development and Management, KDM, we call it as KDM. All these ideas that I mentioned today are new ideas. If we go to Economics department, I don't think there are many economics who understand this. It is related to macroeconomics, but it's not macroeconomics per se. It is related to energy economics, but it is not energy economics per se. It is related to environmental economics, but it is not environmental economics per se. It is related to resource economics, but it is not resource economics per se. It's a new hybrid type of set of the knowledge. There are very few number of experts in the world who understand this. This is one of the issues that I need to tackle as a council member of the GGGI. How I can better communicate with experts outside the GGGI about this new idea. Okay, IMF cannot understand this. World Bank cannot understand. Mission of the World Bank is getting rid of poverty, right? GGGI's mission is helping developed countries to identify new growth plan, growth path. Different, right? GGGI focused on climate change. World Bank, of course, it has a big portfolio about the climate change, but it's not a climate change organization. GCF is a climate change organization, right? GCF is related to World Bank, but if GCF would try to do same as if it would be a World Bank, it would die, right? So this is a new set of knowledge. So that's why GGGI has a KDM department which tries to, diffuse this new set of ideas for GGGI itself, for outside as well. Public-private cooperation, PPC, is also important. I don't need to repeat this important why this department is important again, right? They interact with each other so that the GGGI can bring the best quality services to the client countries. It would be ideal if a GGGI would work for the advanced developing countries, central government level. But to reach that, there are many cases in the GGGI where it focused on province or city levels. But eventually, I encourage the secretary to focus on the major advanced developing countries at the highest level. So I published some of the books in Korean and in English as well. This book came out last June, and then as you can see, even at the time, Ivo Dubois contributed one book chapter. Now later he became the new Director General of the GGGI. This book emphasized the bottom-up approach of the new climate change regime. I think this should be one of the first, possibly first, kind of the book in the world which emphasized the bottom-up approach. So if you are interested in knowing more about the theoretical basis of what the GGGI needs to do, maybe you can borrow, not buy, very expensive, $120, so very expensive, so you can borrow this book from the library. Oops. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.